Greetings, fellow humans. Katrina here. Quick disclaimer, I'm a professional, not your professional. Nothing I'm about to say should be taken as medical, legal, or otherwise advice. This podcast is purely for education and amusement. That is it. Disclaimer over. So today's topic was picked by being given the number 310. And so I went to my Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is a fun book I like to read from. And I opened it to a page I didn't know about, and that was 310, which discusses culture-related diagnostic issues of post-traumatic stress disorder. So I thought I'd rewind a few pages and go through some of the criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I know some of the criteria, I don't think I know all of it, and I don't know if there's been any specific updates to the DSM-5 TR in regards to this particular diagnosis. Maybe I should have Googled that before I did this. Oh well. So, post-traumatic stress disorder diagnostic criteria in individuals older than 6 years old. Note, the following criteria may apply to adults, adolescents, and children older than 6 years. For children 6 years and younger, there's corresponding criteria that it also talks about. A is the first criteria: exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. 1. Directly experiencing the traumatic events. 2. Witnessing in person the events as it occurred to others. 3. Learning the traumatic events occurred to a close family member or a close friend. In cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the events must have been violent or accidental. This is 4, experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic events. For example, first responders collecting human remains, police officers repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse, that sort of thing. And there's a little note here. It's criteria A4 does not apply to exposure through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures, unless this exposure is work-related. So that would be like having to see things on your computer when you're at work that are related to your job, but also horrific. B. Presence of one or more of the following intrusion symptoms associated with the traumatic events beginning after the traumatic event or events occurred. Number 1, recurrent involuntary and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic event or events. Note, in children older than 6 years, repetitive play may occur in which themes or aspects of the traumatic event or events are expressed. 2, recurrent distressing dreams in which the content and/or the affect of the dream are related to traumatic events. Note, in children, there may be frightening dreams without recognizable content. 3, dissociative reactions, for example, flashbacks, in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic events were recurring. Such reactions may occur on a continuum, with the most extreme expression being a complete loss of awareness to present surroundings. Note, in children, trauma-specific reenactment may occur in play. 4, intense or prolonged psychological distress to exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic events or event. 5, marked physiological reactions to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event or events. C, persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic events, beginning after the traumatic events occurred, as evidenced by one or both of the following. 1, avoidance or efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic events or event. All of this can be singular or plural, it seems. 2, avoidance of or efforts to avoid external reminders. So that's things like people, places, conversations, activities, objects, or situations that arouse distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic event or events. D, negative alterations in cognition and mood associated with the traumatic event beginning or worsening after the traumatic event or events occurred, as evidenced by 2 or more of the following. So there's 7 criteria here, and make note that you only need 2. Inability to remember an important aspect of the traumatic event, typically due to dissociative amnesia and not other factors such as head injury, alcohol, or drugs. 2, persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself, others, or the world. For example, I am bad. No one can be trusted. The world is completely dangerous. And lastly, my whole nervous system is permanently ruined. So those are examples of negative beliefs or expectations about oneself. 3, persistent, distorted cognitions about the cause or consequences of the traumatic event or events that led the individual to blame themselves or others. 4, persistent negative emotional state. For example, fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame. 5, markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities. 6, feelings of detachment or estrangement from others. And 7, persistent inability to experience positive emotions, for example, inability to experience happiness, satisfaction, or loving feelings. Now we're on to criterion E. Marked alterations in arousal and reactivity associated with the traumatic event, beginning or worsening after the traumatic event occurred, as evidenced by 2 or more of the following. And there's 6 here in this list, and again, it's just 2 that's required for this. 1, irritable behavior and angry outbursts with little or no provocation, typically expressed as verbal or physical aggression towards people or objects. 2, reckless or self-destructive behavior. 3, hypervigilance. 4, exaggerated startle response. 5, problems with concentration. 6, sleep disturbance, for example, falling or staying asleep or restless sleep. And I want to go back for a minute. Those are the 6, but the one to touch on is hypervigilance. So that's like walking into a room and scanning for the exits, making sure you see all of the people that are there, and sometimes becoming aware of the different things that are there in a way that is not entirely necessary. So for example, if you walk in and need to know where all the exits are, sometimes that's a perfectly normal thing. But if it's like you're on guard, if it's like ready for anything, gotta be ready for anything, that's a little more hypervigilance. F is the next criteria. Duration of the disturbance, so that's criteria B, C, D, and E, is more than 1 month. So under a month, all of these things can happen. And it's not like it doesn't count. It doesn't necessarily meet criteria. G. And I actually might meet criteria for a different one. I'm not going to read about that one today, but maybe I'll do one episode on what I don't know about acute stress disorder. I believe with that one, the stressor occurred more recently, I don't remember the rest of the criteria for that. A lot of it is similar to the post-traumatic stress, as you can tell by acute stress. Just acute means like more in the moment right now. So, G, the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Now, significant distress is somewhat subjective, so that would be something to discuss with a medical provider. Is that subjective experience? Because significant distress for one person might be a Tuesday for another person. Everybody's different. H, the disturbance is not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance. For example, medication, alcohol, or another medical condition. It says to specify whether with dissociative symptoms. So what that is the individual's symptoms meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and in addition, in response to the stressor, the individual experiences persistent or recurrent symptoms of either of the following. And then I'm going to tell you about depersonalization and derealization. So number 1, depersonalization. Persistent or recurrent experiences of feeling detached from and as if one were an outside observer of one's mental processes or body. For example, feeling as though one were in a dream, feeling a sense of unreality of self or body, or of time moving slowly. I'd like to clarify that surreal sense can happen without it being pathologized. So when I went to Ireland and Austria even, and maybe even a little bit in Switzerland, there was this sense of feeling like in a movie almost. Because in Ireland, at least, the green was even greener than over here. And that sounds weird, but it makes sense to me. So derealization is a bit different, but not terribly different. Persistent or recurrent experiences of unreality of surroundings. For example, the world around the individual is experienced as unreal, dreamlike, distant, or distorted. Note, to use this subtype, the dissociative symptoms must not be attributable to the physiological effects of a substance. For example, blackouts during alcohol intoxication or other medical condition. An example of another medical condition could be complex partial seizures. It also indicates to specify if, with delayed expression, if the full diagnostic criteria are not met until at least 6 months after the event, although the onset and expression of some symptoms may be immediate. So remember, there were a few specifications that this diagnosis was for over the age of 6 years old. So now let's talk about post-traumatic stress disorder in children 6 years and younger. So this has a little bit less, but it's still a good 2 pages. A, in children 6 years and younger, exposure to actual or threatened death and serious injury or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. 1, directly experiencing the traumatic events. 2, witnessing in person the events as it occurred to others, especially primary caregivers. 3, learning that the traumatic events occurred to a parent or a caregiving figure. Those are the 3: exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of those 3 ways is criteria A. Now B, presence of one or more of the following intrusion symptoms associated with the traumatic event or events beginning after the traumatic event or events occurred. 1, recurrent involuntary and intrusive memories of the traumatic events. Note, spontaneous and intrusive memories may not necessarily appear distressing and may be expressed as play reenactment. 2. Recurrent distressing dreams in which the content and/or affect of the dream are related to the traumatic event or events. Note, it may not be possible to ascertain that the frightening content is related to the traumatic event. 3. Dissociative reactions. For example, flashbacks, in which the child feels or acts as if the traumatic event or events were recurring. Such reactions may occur on a continuum, with the most extreme expression being a complete loss of awareness of present surroundings. Such trauma-specific reenactment may occur in play. 4. Intense or prolonged psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event or events. 5. Marked physiological reactions to reminders of the traumatic events. Does your brain ever just fill in a word that you think you saw and that's what you say out loud? That's what just happened. I saw physiological and said something else. C is the next criteria. One or more of the following symptoms representing either persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic event or events, or negative alterations in cognitions and mood associated with the traumatic event or events must be present beginning after the event or events or worsening after the event. Persistent avoidance of stimuli. Number 1, avoidance of or efforts to avoid activities, places, or physical reminders that arouse recollection of the traumatic event or events. 2, avoidance of or efforts to avoid people, conversations, or interpersonal situations that arouse recollections of the traumatic event or events. Negative alterations in cognitions. 3, substantially marked increase, added a word there, substantially increased frequency of negative emotional states, for example, fear, guilt, sadness, shame, confusion. 4, markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities, including constriction of play. 5, socially withdrawn behavior. 6, persistent reduction in expression of positive emotions. And so that was the 2 for C, where it says one or more of the following symptoms, and it listed 6. So number 5 was socially withdrawn behavior. Don't jump to any conclusions if a child is acting socially withdrawn, but it is one of the criteria. D, alterations in arousal and reactivity associated with the traumatic event or events, beginning or worsening after the traumatic event occurred, as evidenced by 2 or more of the following. And there's 5 in these. 1, irritable behavior and angry outbursts with little or no provocation, typically expressed as verbal or physical aggression towards people or objects, including extreme temper tantrums. 2, hypervigilance. 3, exaggerated startle response. 4, problems with concentration. 5, sleep disturbance. For example, difficulty falling or staying asleep or restless sleep. E, the duration of the disturbance is more than 1 month. F, the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in relationships with parents, siblings, peers, or other caregivers, or with school behavior. G, the disturbance is not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance, for example, medication or alcohol, or another medical condition. And in the same regard, it does designate to specify with dissociative symptoms and specify if with delayed expression. So I thought I'd skip ahead past some of the diagnostic features back to page 310. So we're going to skip the associated features, prevalence, development and course, risk and prognostic factors, and go right into culture-related diagnostic issues. So, different demographic, cultural, and occupational groups have different levels of exposure to traumatic events, and the relative risk of developing PTSD following a similar level of exposure, for example, religious persecution, may also vary across cultural, ethnic, and racialized groups. Variation in the type of traumatic exposure, for example, genocide, the impact on the disorder, severity of the meaning attributed to the traumatic event, for example, inability to perform funerary rites after a mass killing. The ongoing socio-cultural context, for example, residing among unpunished perpetrators in post-conflict settings, exposure to racial and ethnic discrimination, and other cultural factors, such as acculturative stress in migrants, may influence the risk of onset and severity of PTSD across cultural groups. Some communities are exposed to pervasive and ongoing traumatic environments rather than isolated Criterion A events. In these communities, the predictive power of individual traumatic events for the development of PTSD may diminish. In cultures where social image, for example, maintaining the family's face, is emphasized, public defamation or shaming may magnify the impact of Criterion A events. Some cultures may attribute PTSD syndromes to negative supernatural experiences. The clinical expression of the symptoms or symptom clusters of PTSD can vary culturally in both adults and children. In many non-Western groups, avoidance is less commonly observed, where somatic symptoms, for example, dizziness, shortness of breath, heat sensations, are more common. Other symptoms that vary cross-culturally are distressing dreams, amnesia not related to head injury, and reckless but non-suicidal behavior. Negative moods, especially anger, are common cross-culturally in individuals with PTSD, as are distressing dreams and sleep paralysis. Across cultures, somatic symptoms are frequent, occurring in both children and as adults, especially after sexual trauma. Symptoms that vary cross-culturally in relation to PTSD among children include intrusive thoughts, diminished participation in activities, inability to experience positive emotions, irritability, aggression, and hypervigilance. Distressing dreams, flashbacks, and physiological distress upon exposure to trauma cues, and efforts to avoid memories and thoughts are common in children with PTSD across cultures. In certain cultural contexts, it may be normative to respond to traumatic events with negative beliefs about oneself or with spiritual attributions that may appear exaggerated to others. For example, blaming oneself may be consistent with ideas of karma in South and East Asia, destiny, or spoiled medicine law in West Africa, and cultural differences in locus of control and conceptions of self. In many populations around the world, there are cultural concepts of distress that resemble PTSD and are characterized by diverse manifestations of psychological distress, that time I switched it the other way, attributed to frightening and traumatic experiences. Thus, cultural concepts of distress influence the expression of PTSD and the range of its comorbid disorders. and it has a note to see the culture and psychiatric diagnosis in section 3. I wonder if I can find that. No, that would take a lot of digging to find that particular section. Maybe next time I'll prepare more. So maybe not. This podcast is purely for education and amusement. So sometimes I prepare and sometimes I don't. Today I prepared the topic by picking a page. And one of the things that it mentioned that may have sounded a little confusing was cultural differences in locus of control. So what is a locus of control? That's basically our sense of how much, I don't know if power is the right word, or sense of agency that we have in the world to do what we want and make things happen. So for example, an external locus of control would look like, well, I'm only not rich because I haven't won the lottery. I'll keep playing. And that would be like the only reason I'm not rich, not like all of the multitude of other factors that keep people from being rich. And then internal locus of control is much more, my destiny is my destiny, and I'm going to do what I can to make it happen in the way that I prefer. Is maybe the best way that I can describe that off the top of my head. So locus of control is different in different cultures, and so that's a factor in the diagnostic issues. I did want to mention before I let everyone go, acute stress disorder is actually the very next one on the thing, and it says the duration of the disturbance, so those are the symptoms, the intrusion symptoms and negative mood, is 3 days to 1 month after trauma exposure. And it says, note, symptoms typically begin immediately after the trauma, but persistence for at least 3 days and up to a month is needed to meet diagnostic criteria. And so you see that how acute stress disorder is up to a month, whereas post-traumatic stress disorder was a little bit different. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I want to say it was a month. The duration of the disturbance is more than 1 month. So under a month is probably acute stress disorder, over a month post-traumatic stress disorder. Does everybody who has acute stress disorder develop PTSD? No, that's not the case. And does everybody who experiences trauma experience acute stress disorder? No, not necessarily. It's actually another one that's interesting called adjustment disorders. And that is where the identifiable stressor occurred within 3 months of the onset of the stressors. So that one's not necessarily a traumatic event, but just maybe a major life change. That can be anything from moving to marriage, divorce, that kind of thing. So those are some things that I don't know about today. Next week, I'll talk a little bit more about what I don't know and maybe another interesting diagnosis. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you want to contribute to the show, click the button on the website. I do appreciate each and every one of you simply for existing.